The funniest thing in this book is a severed head. Trust me, it's good. Cheers. Welcome back, everybody, to me telling you about a book, one specific book that is very, very hard to find, but you really, 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 really should go and read it as quickly as possible. Anyway, we are talking about The Broken Land, sometimes called Hands, Hearts and Voices in the UK, by Ian MacDonald. It's from 1992 and it's very, very hard to find, except for an ebook, which is why I was a bit hesitant to talk about it, but it's such a brilliant masterpiece of work that I really want to talk about it. And if you find it somewhere as a used paperback or whatever, get it. If you are like me and bought an audiobook when it was available on Audible, congratulations, the audiobook is fantastic. If you have a Kindle, you can get it on ebook. It's a very unique book, and I want to tell you all about it. We'll do the thing, I'll give you a synopsis, it'll be a bit more detailed, and then I'll talk about why I think this book is so very, very good. That will entail spoilers. I don't think it's the kind of book that suffers much from knowing spoilers, but, you know, be aware of it. As I said, I was thinking about this because usually when I talk about books, I'm like, yeah, you can read this book and quickly, but with this one, I don't know what to say. It's a real shame. It's hard to find. But as I said, The Broken Land, or Hearts, Hands and Voices, by Ian MacDonald from 1992. There's a newer ebook version. Get it, because it's fantastic. It's also very hard. So let me also add, content warning, this is very much about imperialism, colonialism, civil war, and all the ugly things that are connected to that. Refugees, refugee camps. If all of that stuff is sort of, you know, giving you a hard time because, well, it's kind of fucked up anyway, and this touches too close to home, yeah, be aware of that. So we'll talk about that as well. Anyway, let's give you a synopsis, and then let's dig deeper, right? All right. So, as I said, The Broken Land, I'll call it this because I have the American version of it, released in 1992, is a science fiction novel. It is set in a far, 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 far future, possibly on our world, possibly on a different world. It doesn't really matter that much. It's set in a place that has been conquered by the emperor, or the emperor across the river. And this country does have two different religions. That country has confessors and it has proclaimers, and they don't like each other that much, but they live both in this state of, well, being ruled by an empire across the river. And it's a country, it's a world in which people have managed to create polymer plastics that behave like living matter. So machines are not built, they are bred and like animals, basically. And humans have the ability to directly manipulate what they call plasma, which is probably just living matter with they can directly manipulate the DNA of matter and living matter and turn it into all kinds of stuff. So it's very far future. There's no explanations how these technologies work. It's basically magical realism in that regard, which also is the language. It's very magical realist. It starts with like grandfather was a tree, father grew trucks in 15 colors, and so forth. It's a very interesting far future world that reads like very dreamlike, psychedelic, magical realism in a lot of ways. The story follows Matembe, who is a young girl, and we follow her while she grows up. She does not speak, which is not the same as cannot speak. She has decided to not speak. And we follow her through all the tribulations that happen when a country rises up against its imperial overlords, and there is a rebellion, and what happens afterwards when all the old feuds break up and so forth. We follow her through that and through her attempts to find her family, keep her family together, and do all the things she feels she has to do. So that's the rough plot line. There are things happening during that that are obviously going to be very harsh. We see people being dispossessed. We have people being turned into refugees. We have people being terrorized by militias. We have all those things, but we have all of them in this very weird, dreamlike world described by a very unique, dreamlike language in a lot of ways, and it's one of the most touching books I've read in a long time. It's one of the most heart-rending books in a lot of ways. I think it's really, really worthwhile reading, because it deals with a lot of stuff that we see every day on the news, that we have seen every day on the news forever and ever and ever. And this book even talks about like how that's kind of fucked up. And let me say, go read it if you can find it. It will affect you. It will probably turn you into a slightly different person afterwards, and I think that's a good thing. So yeah, I don't rate books, but this one is definitely really high up there. So go get it. I'll have a bit of beer, and then we'll talk about why I think it does the things that it does so incredibly well. And yeah, let's do that. All right, let's start with the language, because I think that's one of the unique parts. Now, if you have read a lot of Ian MacDonald, or at least some Ian MacDonald novels, there is a shift in his style. There are some things that are very unique to his style that he always does. The way he builds sentences that sometimes feel like, that start in medias res, like start with the verbs, like doing something, something, something. He does that and that. He has some idiosyncrasies that you recognize again in his style after a while. However, there has been a shift over time. When you read his first novel, Desolation Road, which is very much magical realism on Mars, it has a lot of this dreamlike quality, the way things just shift meaning in the middle of sentences, and he creates metaphors through that, which is a very, very specific sort of literary style that we don't necessarily connect to science fiction. And over time he has, when his subject matter has become more closer to our reality, his language has also shifted closer to our reality. It usually still, takes on aspects of the place that he's talking about. When you go to something like Brazil, it has a lot of like very specific rhythm in his language. The way he constructs sentences and so forth follows certain rhythms, because obviously dancing samba, but also other dances play a big role in that book. When you go to the Dervish House, for example, it has a very languid flowing tone, because that book is very much about parts of Istanbul that are sort of forgotten by time because they're not in the backwaters and so forth. So he's a master of doing that. So what kind of language does he choose for this specific story? I think that's an important part. And it's, as I said, it's an early one. It's his third novel, I think, it comes right after Desolation Road and King of the Morning, Queen of the Day, which you also should absolutely go and read. I mean, you should read all Ian MacDonald books that you can find, is my point. And it harkens closer to what you see in Desolation Road language-wise than what you see in King of the Morning, Queen of the Day, where, of course, the language shifts from the first being, letters, 19th century, early 20th century correspondence novel style, moving through a Joycean part into a full-on cyberpunk style. This time he goes back sort of to what we can see in in Desolation Road, but there's also like an oral storytelling quality to it in a lot of ways. There are weird metaphors sometimes in the middle of the language, in the middle of a story. He switches perspective. We have like a third person narrative talking about what happens to Matembe and so forth, and then we have parts that are suddenly in second person, and it's like you do this, you do this, you do this, which is obviously as if this is narrated to Matembe, because it's still about Matembe in this regard. And this is obviously can be disorienting, and this disorientation is obviously important, and we have parts that are first person plural. It's like we do this as ourselves and so forth, which is, as I said, once again, it's sort of disorienting, but it also makes a lot of sense, because this book is very much about like how the individual positions itself towards the other, how the collective positions itself towards the individual. All of these things are important themes of this book, because of what we'll talk about in a minute when we talk about the deeper themes. And that, I think, makes it makes sense, but it is certainly something that you need to get used to when you're reading this book. But I think it supports the themes and the story stylistically, which is obviously the hallmark of someone who really knows what they're doing when they're writing a book. I wish I could do that. So we have that first part. Once again, we have these cascades, these almost like, yeah, what I meant by like an oral storytelling like quality. We have these cascades when we have descriptions of events that almost feel like a poetry, like almost like a song, like a ritual singing dance situation. And I think that also helps because a lot of this is about sort of group dynamics, mass dynamics in a lot of ways, and having these elements in there sort of help set the mood for what is described simply by shifting perspective, shifting point of view, shifting rhythm, and shifting word choices. That is obviously a fantastic way of doing this, and I think it's important to know that. It reads unlike most science fiction that you read these days. I feel maybe N.K. Jemisin comes close to it in a lot of what she does in her books. So I think that's certainly one of the few comparisons I can make here is somewhere between N.K. Jemisin and Ursula Le Guin is what I would say is this when it comes to how to use language, how to use language to inform the deeper meaning and storytelling. So that's the first part that I wanted to talk about. Now let's talk about setting. And I think this is the next part that is important. See, when you look at reviews for this book, or when you look at criticism, it's very easy to say this is what Ian MacDonald wrote about his experience in Northern Ireland or in Ireland in general. Obviously, that has had an impact. MacDonald, having lived through the Troubles, still living in Belfast, has a very specific experience of a very specific country. That is a post-colonial country in parts, still a colonial country when you're in Northern Ireland. And it has had its fair share of religious conflict. So some of the big sort of elements here are very clearly inspired by Northern Ireland, but it's not set in Ireland or Northern Ireland, right? Yes, you can map, confessors and proclaimers on Protestants and Catholics. You can do that, and you can map the emperor across the river to Britain, and those historical parallels will sort of hold up. But it's not set in Ireland, and it's set in the very, very far future. And I think that helps. That is important. I've spoken about this before, about the idea that some level of alienation can help to drive a point home. Because, see, we watch the news all the time. Some of us do, some of us have given up. A lot of times we sort of distance ourselves from the real horror out there, which is, important because we need to sort of get up in the morning and do stuff like, drink beer and talk about books in science fiction books. So this is understandable, but to drive home very specific points about human interaction, human experience, and so forth, sometimes you need to sort of wrench the mind out of that rut of realism that we're in. So that's one way of why going into the future, why not putting it there. If you write the novel about this very specific experience, setting it there can be helpful, but it also can distract because suddenly you have to, get it right, get it historically right, and not getting the meaning right. You know what I mean? So that's one point. The other point is, of course, this is not just a very specific Northern Irish or Irish experience. A story in which, obviously, an empire gives up or is defeated and removes its forces mostly from a colony. That has happened before. Religiously motivated civil war is not something that we haven't seen before. And that is sort of the important, the structural elements behind this, that imperial powers, when in colonies, usually find a minority, religious minority, empower them and make them sort of their enforcers over the larger population. That has happened in all kinds of places. You look at post-colonial Africa, you look at a lot of these civil wars where they sort of come from. A lot of that is because a minority was in power or was able to, was empowered by the imperial overlords during the time of colonialism, and there will be payback. There will be a lot of stuff coming up once the imperial force is removed. It has led to a lot of terrible war crimes, genocides, and so much more in that regard. You can even go down to South Africa. You can look at the Balkans. This book was published in 1992. There may be influences or impacts from the early Balkan Wars, when you suddenly have a religious conflict not lead to, but sort of also be one motivating part in a larger civil war. There are some sort of ethnic differences with the Confessors and Proclaimers in this book, right? They are genetically already built that one group is left-handed and the other is right-handed, which is then sort of tied back into their religion and so forth. But there are sort of visible differences between those two. Let's put it this way, because obviously they are all human, which is kind of the point at the end. You can look at that. If you read it right now in the year 2024, you might see elements of the war in Gaza and the situation in Israel and Palestine in these books, in this book. The point is, these situations are unfortunately very much part of imperialism, part of colonialism, part of post-colonialism. Once imperial forces are fought off or retreat for other reasons, conflicts that were sort of built up or not becalmed, but frozen sort of during the time of imperial rule, but sometimes also inflamed by, once again, building up the strength of usually one specific minority, will break out again, and all that pent-up rage and anger will vent itself in those situations. That shit is unfortunately a global situation, not just a very specific Northern Irish or Irish situation. And by taking this story that has very visible elements of the specific Irish situation, but setting it in a far future that is incredibly unrecognizable from anywhere on this globe. You can't pinpoint where we are, which river this is. You can't do that in the story. The language, the names are obviously very specific, sort of vaguely East African, sort of coded in a lot of ways. Matembe, Filele, and so forth. Those are names that I, with no knowledge whatsoever, would probably situate somewhere on the East African shores, coast, somewhere like Kenya or that area, roughly. So it is vaguely set there in that regard, but once again, it does have all these other elements in there, and that makes it universal. And that is important because it is a universal thing. It's not just an Irish thing. It's not just an African thing. It's not just a Palestinian thing. It's imperialism, is what it is. And I think that makes it very, very powerful in that way. So let's come back to language for a moment, because language is important here on a deeper level, which makes obviously the choice of style that McDonald has very important as well. But we begin with a one episode where because the Empire took over the country there, how they changed the names from old language to new language, and that's one of those things that we have certainly seen in, once again, not only in Ireland, but very specifically in Ireland, very specifically in Wales, what the British do when they change names, when they literally erase names, change them to English language, when they forbid people from learning, Gaelic languages. That has happened there. But it has also happened in all kinds of other places of imperialism. Once again, this happens all over the place. It's just that because we know death of the author and all of that, we know that MacDonald lives in Belfast. The first association is must be Irish. But once again, so language is in that part something that defines us, and that is a good thing, but it's also a bad thing, which is why Matembe's grandfather decides no longer to use words that have been changed and then dies, which is why one of the reasons why Matembe doesn't speak at all and uses the language of the heart, which then in the end is turned into the language of the soul and the universal meaning once they have this form of telepathy, when people can actually speak to each other and understand that everyone is literally just humans, and those differences are mostly just differences in words, differences in meaning, and not differences in meaning, just differences in expression, and those stand between us and create conflicts in a lot of ways. And I think that is powerful because it shows us that so often language can be used as a tool of oppression, as a tool of suppression, by changing words, I mean, you'll have read your Orwell, I assume, so we kind of know that, but using this form of colonial oppression when it comes to language, I think, is a very powerful element that goes throughout the entire story. Gabriel Kay did a similar thing, at least in part, with Tigana, so just another connection there. So yeah, language in that regard. What else? Yeah, showing the horror. With all the sort of dreamlike elements in here, the idea of the powerful images of creating life, all of that stuff in here, there are some stark depictions of horror that sort of break through, and I think this is, once again, why choosing this dreamlike language, this floating, hazy language style from time to time makes those outbreaks of violence so very, very powerful when we have the situation when Matembe's father and all the other men are taken apart, taken aside from the people by the militia, and while the attack by the helicopters on the township in the beginning, those situations are incredibly brutal by suddenly not being, you know, weirdly science fiction-y, because suddenly they are realistic. Suddenly it's helicopters shooting fire. Yeah, that's very real, you know. And that shift, sort of that ultra-violence coming out of something that highly stylized language and parts in between, I think is a very interesting and very powerful tool that McDonald's uses here. I guess one final thing that I want to talk about in detail is duty, responsibilities, and so forth. Where we see Matembe as older sister sort of assume the leadership of the group, even though she is never actually the leader of the group, but she feels responsible to keep everyone together. When her mother kind of breaks down after their father is taken away by the militia, she sort of feels responsible. She's trying to keep her brother away from becoming, you know, a radical freedom fighter, because obviously that's not very healthy for anyone. She's trying to find her family once they're separated. She tries to do all of these things, and by doing that, she loses herself, and that is the really dark message here, or the dark sort of implication, is that in these situations, in these conflicts, whenever there is violence, it is children that suffer. It is children that are forced to become adult, that are forced to take on responsibilities, that blot out their selves, their wishes, their dreams, because it's not what Matembe wants. Matembe thinks she has to. It's all about what she has to or believes she has to. It's never about what she wants, what she dreams. And we see that self-denial and that self... I'm lacking words. Throughout the story, which is incredibly tragic and powerful and sad. And which is why the ending does feel powerful, when she does finally realize what she actually wants and changes the world and decides to maybe save everyone by bringing peace. Now, obviously, it's depressing that is through technology, but the understanding is that if we actually learn to listen, if we actually learn to speak to each other, to leave behind those meanings, the different expressions of language, and try to drill down to the meaning as much as we can, we will understand each other, because we are all in this together as humans in one planet, and we need to do this together. And through that, we will hopefully sort of through a more spiritual, personal connection to faith, if faith is necessary. If not, then that's that. But like through that understanding, we will hopefully have a way out of these deeply ingrained conflicts. We can heal the wounds that imperialism, that colonialism have wrought about upon everyone. That is a powerful message. I'm not sure how much I stand behind it, but it's good to actually find some positivity near the end of this very, very bleak story. And I think that is very, well, meaningful and powerful. There's so much more, but I don't know what else to say at this moment. I'm going to reread this. It's one of those books that like sticks with you for a long time, and I can only hope that you find a copy and read it. If you have read it in the past, if you're one of the, I don't know, probably 10 people that have, let me know in the comments what you thought about it. If you plan to read it, let me know what you think about it, what you thought about it. I'd love to hear from you. Thanks for doing this. Like, subscribe, comment. There's a Patreon if you feel like it. Sorry for this being a bit of a bleak one. I will probably go and talk about some other Ian McDonald's books because someone has to. And yeah, I'll see you in the next one. And until then, thanks and cheers.